Yes, welcome everyone. Welcome. Definitely want to hear from you in the chat. So once you get here, go ahead, put your name, your role, where you're tuning in from. It'd be fantastic to get to meet you all prior to us getting rolling. All right. So welcome everyone to our event today, 4 trends that we're seeing in the DEIB space. And you all are going to get some fantastic value from both Angela and LaTonya today. I'm going to give them space to introduce themselves here in a moment, but before I do that, I'm going to introduce myself. So my name is Raymond Ashiel, but I do go by Recovery Ray. I wear a couple different hats in my professional life. So on one hand, I am the operations and strategy leader for Call for Culture, which you'll learn more about Call for Culture from our CEO here in a moment. But I'm also a CEO myself. I run an organization called Balance Period, which is a wellness and health equity firm. And so our mission is here to help create a world where generational wellness is accessible to everyone. And when we think about our wellness, one of those dimensions is our occupational wellness, which is why I'm super excited to be the moderator of this conversation and to contribute in any way that I can. Because when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, it has the ability to completely transform our quality of life in the workplace. But unfortunately, there are obstacles that we face in that space these days, and that's why today's conversation is happening. So I want to hand it over first to Angela for her to introduce herself, and then we'll hand it over to LaTonya.
Perfect. Hello, everyone. It's good to be here with you all today. Thank you for your patience as we worked through getting you all into the room. I know we have a little bit of a late start, but excited that you all are here and spending your time with us. As Ray mentioned, I'm Angela Howard, CEO of Call for Culture, and looking forward to chatting with LaTonya. So I'll bounce it to you, LaTonya, for your intro.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm LaTonya Wilkins. I'm the founder and CEO of Change Coaches, the author of Leading Below the Surface, How to Build Real and Psychologically Safe Relationships with People Who Are Different from You. I'm excited to be here today. I met Angela probably about a couple of years ago. We've always said that we were going to do something together. So really excited to have this conversation. I think it'll be a nice organic conversation that brings together or weaves together two really important parts of DEIB, culture and leadership. And these are the two that are often forgotten.
Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you both for your introductions. I just want to let everyone know before we dive into our first topic of conversation that it is okay to ask your questions. I have the chat pulled up on my end, so feel free to ask questions as you are hearing what is shared. We will have some designated time at the end to answer questions, but we will also be answering some of those along the way as well. Okay, so feel free to drop your questions in the chat and we will be sure to address those. And without further ado, I want to hand it over to Angela to talk about this first aspect of culture. So I'm gonna hand it over to you, Angela. What is that first trend that you noticed as it relates to culture and the impact that it has on our DEIB pursuits?
Yeah. So, and LaTonya, I'm sure we're gonna kind of bounce and vibe with each other here because culture and leadership are so intertwined that we can't really talk about one without the other. And so I want to start with this lack of focus and strategy around DEIB. What we tend to see with clients is, I call it the throwing spaghetti at the wall tactic, which is like, let's just try all the things. Let's add all of the programs to see what sticks. And so I think just this myth that you have to add on to make DE&IB operationalize. A lot of the work that we do within organizations is really around deconstructing. And so, LaTonya, I don't know, what are your thoughts on that from a leadership perspective? Because there's a lot of like mindset and behavioral shifts that need to happen. And that's not always about adding on.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think when you're talking about culture with the adding on, I wrote an article and I'll drop it in the chat last month in the training industry in magazine. And it was all about how to use coaching to create DEIB structures and systems in the workplace. And one of the things I started with is in that article is, what are you trying to do? because again, it's okay if you're only trying to do a little, right? It's okay if you say, all I'm trying to do this year is to hire more technologists of color, or all I'm trying to do this year is to make my leadership team more diverse, or all I want to do this year is get some conversations started around managing people in a more human way. That's all right. And it's really just starting there. And as Angela said, I think where a lot of orgs struggle with is they're always trying to add on, right? They're always trying to, if they just pick one of those, they're like, this isn't enough. If we look at our colleagues that are bragging about this online, they're going to be looked at as better than us. So that's similar to what I'm seeing is, this add-on effect where 1 or 2 goals is fine. And I'm a professional coach. And honestly, that's what we do. I mean, it's 1 or 2 goals over 6 months. If your boss asks for more than that, then you're not going to be able to achieve your goals.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times I think we forget that, DE&IB is culture work. It's not like we have culture transformation over here and now we have a DE&I program over here. These things are intertwined, and really we have to go back to the values of the organization. And so I would love to hear, LaTonya, about this idea of behavior change, because that's my second theme from a cultural perspective. It is really around the gap in commitment and commitment to change. A lot of times we see people like leaders say, oh, everyone else needs to change, so let's create this program so everyone else can change, but we're good. The executive team is good. So when it comes to coaching, I'm sure you encounter this a ton. I'm sure I'm not the only one.
Yeah. It's really interesting because just today actually last week, my team and I, we ran a workshop for 100 healthcare leaders at the top of this organization. And the team followed up, the HR team followed up and asked for more. They were like, can we share this? How do we get this to the second level down? And actually, I was really excited that they asked for that, because we took all the time for the senior leaders to come into this room. They're reading everything. They're going through everything from the book to the workshop, coming back to that, to the learner guides. And now they're thinking about behavioral change, right? And they're realizing this on a couple different levels. First off, for them to make behavioral change, it's going to be very difficult because of all the structures that they have to operate in with healthcare. And second, how do they talk to their staff about this? Like, if they're struggling themselves, how are they going to talk to their staff about this? And so, so one of the things that we're doing for them is we are doing some group coaching apply sessions, so they could bring those to us without any judgment, right? That's the thing. It's like really, and that's one of the trends that I talk about is, creating the psychological safety for growth. And, it's interesting because, I was talking about this in a keynote yesterday, like a lot of times, just many of you may not know this, but just sharing, any of your weaknesses or any of your mistakes with your team already creates psychological safety. And we have to create that safety for our leaders instead of calling them out, calling them in, so they can change. So it creates that behavioral change, that space to make that. So I think behavioral change takes a long time, number one, because there's lack of psychological safety. When I talk about sharing your slips, making mistakes, I think number two, there's like, if you are, and Angela, you mentioned this at the executive team level, it just doesn't get cascaded. And it's not because they don't want to, they just don't know how to. They're still digesting everything, and the systems that they're operating in are not amenable to where they're trying to go. And so those are a couple of things just to remember. But behavioral change is really hard. And I'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about, the structures and systems around leadership development. But Angela, I'd love to hear what you think about that, especially from a cultural perspective with the behavioral change and what some of those barriers are.
I think, all this work is mind shift and behavioral change, and that gets manifested and translated into structures, policies, programs, how we operationalize this work. And so, 100%, we see when we're working with clients that there's a lot of unlearning to be done. And I'm actually working on a piece right now about how when we experience it with the client, it feels like a grieving process. because we know that change kind of mirrors some of the stages of grief, which is just really interesting. And I don't think we should underestimate that, because if you're changing as a person, if your values are shifting as an organization, you're in the process of letting go of what could be or what is. And that is that's a psychological and an emotional process that I don't think we give enough credit to when we talk about this work. So we spent a lot of time creating that safety and that space, and also respectfully and boldly challenging. And that's that's an art and a science. to say it lightly, it's an art and a science at the same time, and working through those shifts.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that with the stages of grief, and how it's really hard to let go, and that's okay. Again, it's like we have to make that okay, right? And that's, it's with change management when it fails, and you're thinking about all the people that have a hard time, even I'm just going to use technology, like switching to a new system. And you're like, well, I don't really care. I'm not going to even talk you through that. That doesn't work. We have to acknowledge and validate that this is hard. This is hard to change. And before we move on to our next trend, Angela, I'd love to hear from the group. Is there anything that you're seeing, especially around strategy, before we move to the next, and behavioral change that you're seeing before you move to the next trends in your organization? Anyone want to either drop that in chat or take themselves off mute and discuss that? Anything else you're seeing before we move on to the next trend? All right, let's go to the next trend. So, Angela, what did you have for the next one that you were thinking? It looks like more of the damaging archetypes. I love to talk about leadership archetypes. Let's talk about that topic.
Yeah. So, there are these 3 archetypes that at Call for Culture, we've been, because we use human-centered design when it comes to this work. And one of the tactics we use is really understanding, for lack of better words, like avatars within organizations. There's some archetypes and avatars that tend to pop up quite a bit when we're working with clients. One of the archetypes, and there's 3 of them specifically that we're kind of studying in depth to understand, how should we be approaching these people, communicating with them, learning about their fears, their needs, their perspective. And the one archetype is what we call the traditional HR gatekeeper. And so this is the HR person who, and again, I'm kind of putting a stereotype to this profile, but it's this person who's maybe been in their role for 10 years, 20 years. They're a traditional HR person. They know HR process inside and out. They've built HR teams, and they're really keen to be kind of that right hand to the CEO. And so, and they often hold on to work around, let's say, people, DE&I, they harness the work and sometimes just want to take credit for it, when in reality, they should really be working themselves out of a role, which is very counter to the mindset that they have around, I am the people person, I am the HR person, I am the keeper of all things HR strategy or people strategy, versus how do we create more collaboration across the organization? How do we create sustainability within the organization with our leaders, where HR is maybe setting strategy, facilitating and guiding, but the CEO and the leadership team are really taking the work and the ownership around the work. So that's one of the archetypes we see that becomes a derailer for some of this work. The other one is the DEIB leader superhero. So this is the person that the company hires, right? Because we've revved up our DE&I efforts. We're hiring that chief DE&I officer, that chief impact officer, and they come in with the cape, and everyone's like, "Oh, we're doing DE&I now," and oftentimes they are the ones that are, again, housing the DE&I strategy. They're meant to be the heroes from a DE&I perspective, when, again, in reality, we should really be building capability in order to sustain the work long term. And then the last archetype is what we call the well-intended CEO. This is the person who maybe has read about DE&I, they've read a book, and they've read LaTonya's book, right? And they now want to do the work around DE&I. And at the surface, it all sounds really, really great, but the commitment isn't there. So oftentimes we go into organizations and we do our assessment, because we do have an assessment that we use as a part of our work. And they're like, oh, I thought you were going to like recommend training or something. It's like they don't want to do the hard work to actually get there. So they're well intended, but the commitment isn't quite there to make the change, or they don't want to make the change in themselves. So those are kind of the three archetypes that we've been studying a bit more. And how do we shift their mindset, or the mindset of the organization around that archetype? So I know that was long-winded, but would love to hear, LaTonya, your thoughts and what you've seen when you've been working with these different leaders from a coaching perspective.
Yeah. Let's stay on leadership archetypes for a second, because that was actually a little bit around, that gets me to my second trend, and then we'll get to the chat. So if anybody has any questions, or there's another topic you'd like to explore more, you could drop that in the chat and then we'll go there. But I think you're exactly right. I love the archetypes that you talk about, because I think everybody could visualize. I could see the cape right now, and it's the person that's really excited, and maybe they have like an LGBTQ plus, like relative or child, or, it's like, yeah, I'm ready to do this. I'm the best ally, and I'm going to put this cape on. And then they don't ask the groups what they need, and they just continue moving forward. And so, yeah, I could see that one. So a lot in my work, what I talk about is the dominant leadership standard. And some of you here have read my book, I know, and I have a whole chapter where I talk about the way that leadership has been constructed that no longer works for the workplace today. Again, the way that leadership has been constructed no longer works for the way our workplace is today. And that's what I call the dominant standard, because a dominant population has created this leadership standard, right? I'm not saying that some of the nuggets aren't good, but how many of you are sick of seeing the same leadership books over and over recycled through your organization, teaching you how to do things, and you don't really even identify with that? So it's not even just that. It's not even, that's the tip of the iceberg, where it's not even any diversity in that thinking. I call those KPEs, knowledge, perspective, or experiences. There's no thinking around that. But there's also not a lot in there around how we're treating each other. What are we valuing in leadership? There's still like this dominant standard of competition over collaboration, decisiveness. You better hurry up. If you can't make a decision, you're weak, or you need to talk more, you need to speak up more. And again, you might need to do those things, but there's different types of styles, right? And that just because that worked for the dominant doesn't mean that works for you. And that doesn't mean that's how your team values should look. So that's my second trend. It's really around having structure around leadership development. And it's really, this is something that we focus on a lot, because I find it very disappointing. I've been doing leadership development for a long time, that, a lot of times when orgs call us, some of them say, oh, well, we want to do a DEI training. And I'm like, we do leadership development. So if you want to do something and you want to talk about leadership and develop your leaders, this is what we do. Yeah, we have some stuff in there that might qualify as DEI, but this is actually how leaders need to lead today. Gone are the days of, let's do a whole core leadership program, and we have one little inclusive leadership side over here, and that's going to be a special edition. No, we don't do any of that, right? And so it's having structures around that, right? And again, I'll go back to the healthcare leaders we were working with last week, the top 100. They're still thinking of this way. And so the org has to shift, because they're like, well, wait, like if I'm going to do this, like, how can I be a courageous leader? How can I actually, this is all in the same bucket, and you got to start thinking about this. You got to start thinking about this as, something that's a collective plan, not something, again, that's a side dish. Like every day you're going to be dealing with different generations. Every day you're going to be dealing with people who are different from you. Every day you are going to have to look at, your team and evaluate whether your practices are equitable. That is leadership. right? That is everyday leadership, what you need to be doing. And so, yeah, that's what I mean around this, the structures of leadership development. Again, this is something that's lacking. And I think it's a lot of where the backlash is coming from. You know, I've even had leaders come to me and be like, we want to hire your company because I feel like this is disguised. I'm like, what's disguised? It's not disguised. This is what leadership is. Because they'll say, well, you know, if I talk to, you know, if I'm too direct about this stuff, we'll lose people. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, what are you even trying to do? And it goes back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier. But I'm seeing a lot of this. Again, it's getting derailed because we're not really recognizing, again, the leader's pain point. And we're also not making, again, it's safe to be able to change, safe to be able to talk about the things that Angela talked about with the grieving process, safe to be able to, you know, be called into the discussion when you're really struggling, because again, the systems were not built this way. So Angela, what do you think of all that? And then maybe we could get to the chat.
Oh yeah, I'm just digesting everything you just said, because I think it's so important. I just came back from a client visit last night, actually, and we were talking about this idea that we've kind of like cut off the bar and really like accepted a really mediocre version of management, which we have this opportunity to lead, right? We promote technical managers because they're really great at their jobs without acknowledging the fact that actually, when you step into a leadership position, you now have a responsibility within the organization. It's not just a way to improve yourself as a professional, but as a person. And I think sometimes we just really bucket, you know, we glorify technical managers and promote them into leadership positions without the perspective that people leadership is really hard. We call these things soft skills, but they're actually the hardest of all skills. And so one of the things that I talk to with a lot of my clients is the fact that we need to create paths for both career paths. We need to say, hey, leadership is a choice. We would love to develop you into leaders and have that collective leadership program within the organization. We have tools for you. You're a first-time leader and you've chosen to be in this role and you feel that responsibility to people. Yes, we're going to develop you into that. But if you don't want to, if you want to opt out and be a really fantastic individual contributor or technical project manager, there's a path for that too. There's a big fancy title and pay for that as well. But we really have to start to delineate between this idea of technical management and leadership because they're very different. And when you're in leadership positions, you can cause true harm. And I would love to, before we kind of bounce it back to you all, Ray, I would love to hear your perspective from a wellness perspective, because there's a lot that's coming out currently around the impact that leaders can have on mental health and the harm that can be done when it comes to leadership. So I'd love to hear from you on that from a wellness perspective.
Yeah. And thinking about the way that we lead, it's heavily impacted by how we care for ourselves, right? And so we can talk to our teams or our people about various different things that we want to implement, but if we're not implementing them ourselves and truly modeling these behaviors and these changes that we want to see, then there's going to be some sort of dissonance there. The odds of adherence of these things from our team, will be lower. And so what literally drives the work that I do is helping individuals understand the impact and the influence that they have on the people around them, and how you just focusing on developing yourself and enhancing your quality of life based on your mindset, based on the habits that you practice, right? The ripple effect that has. And now you speaking and saying, hey, you all need to do X, Y, Z. You can model these behaviors, tell your story around the transformation that you made in order to become the leader that you are. And that in and of itself becomes the catalyst for the change that you want to see in your team, in your department, in your organization. And so understanding that caring for yourself as a leader is pivotal. It's important. Not only does it impact how you lead, but it impacts who you show up as when you're leading, because there's a whole lot of data to show the impact of not caring for yourself having on your cognitive function and your just ability to execute in general. So from a wellness perspective, I think focusing inward on yourself and understanding that the investment that you make into your wellness will ultimately be shown and demonstrated in your leadership style and your ability to impact the individuals that you do get an opportunity to lead.
Yeah, so would love to hear from you all. We've talked about, and I just want to recap because we talked about a lot of things, but just to narrow in on the themes, the first theme, and we're talking about things that are derailing your DEIB efforts. The first thing is the lack of strategy and focus around this work. It's also the myth that you have to add on to succeed around this work. We talked about, sometimes it's about deconstructing, or to Ray's point, reevaluating, having that self-awareness. The second thing is gaps in behavior change. So I mentioned 3 archetypes, 3 particular profiles that we're seeing in this work that are derailing our efforts. And then LaTonya talked about lack of structures around leadership development and why and how that can be creating some of our DEIB backlash. And then the last thing, which I'd love to talk a little bit more about if we have some time, is the lack of psychological safety and growth. And I think that, again, kind of ties back into Ray's comments around if we're not safe, if we're not environments where we're safe, or we're not having that self-awareness, it's really hard for us to transfer that to our team. So would love to hear from you all. What are your thoughts? What are some other derailers that we may have missed in the conversation here?
Yeah, and while people are taking themselves off mute, I want to go through a few of the comments. So yeah, I love the action bias. That's a really great point, Crystal. And I think it's important to make the point that this is not just leaders. I think it's also DEIB leaders. Like I think this goes back to the dominant standard of making sure that you're doing a lot. Like if you're not busy doing a ton, then you're not doing enough. And so that's a very important point. And again, scaling that back, if it's only 1 or 2, even from a coaching perspective, that's probably all you're going to get done in 6 months, right? Is that one goal. We have Trace that talked about, optimistic trends and structures and systems. We have, thank you, Eliza. Hey, it's good to see you, to talk about, just the white supremacy that's built into some of these norms. And yeah, the power skills versus soft skills, and really being able to think about those in a different way. Again, it's like, how are we trained what are we trained to value? And we have to really, rethink all of that, especially if we're going to move forward at this point, because there's some people that are even predicting that at some point, DEIB might, and I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but it might go away and it might be absorbed into like some other org development type functions. And so just being able to talk about that and how that might fit into other areas, because again, this is something that again, we're seeing a big backlash and people are being let go and people aren't reporting into the CEOs anymore. So this is something that's also really important.
Yeah, I love the term power skills. I've been trying to find the right term because soft skills just does not work anymore. I mean, these are human skills. These are power skills. These are the most important skills. I mean, I can't stress that enough. And there's a few other comments here. So Trace mentioned how to get senior leaders to see, accept, and act in a way that role models change. I often find that newer employees and mid-level managers are more on board than leaders. Absolutely. We see something similar when we're doing the work with organizations. A lot of times there's this huge disconnect on perception, which is really interesting to see around what our executives or leadership team thinks is happening and what's being progressed or not progressed in this work, and employees. And that's always the biggest aha moment we have, where we're like, we have to tell the team that you think this is happening, but it's not. The mass majority of people are not feeling the impact of this work. So you're wasting a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of resources. You're not focused on the right things, essentially. And then Crystal mentioned that I love the fact that we're amplifying the need to deconstruct practices. Building beautiful structures on broken foundations aren't sustainable. And that is what we have always done, causing the unended cycle that leads to burnout. Oh my gosh, yes. A big love for that. LaTonya, how are you seeing from a coaching perspective? Like, is that sticking with people when your team is talking to leaders, and are they understanding kind of how to do that, how to deconstruct, how to deconstruct structures that are deteriorating essentially our culture?
They don't. That's the thing. And it's, again, we work with a lot of very senior leaders, like, leadership teams, next level down, and they don't. And again, it's at that level, some of you are going to probably look at me and be like, LaTonya, they need to know how to do this, but guess what? They don't. And I think that's when we don't allow the safety for them to be able to learn and be able to ask for the structures to be changed or be able to empower them. Because a lot of times you're thinking that this next layer down, they have power. They don't. They have way less power than you think. They're not making a lot of these decisions, especially the bigger budgeting decisions on what we spend time on. And so that's why we do the group coaching, because then we can get everybody in a room and we can gain some awareness on what we call the roadblocks. We'll have a whole roadblock, like session focus on what's getting in the way, especially the leadership teams. And a lot of times, this is interesting that all of you might not realize, but psychological safety is usually lacking at that level. And when it's lacking at that level, there's really nothing that team can do, right? And so you really have to address that first. And that's where we deconstruct that. I love what Trace's comment is around middle managers. But again, for middle managers to be able to do this, we have to have that level be able to do it first, right? So they can bring those folks in and reinforce it, coach them as they go through the process. Because again, it's very difficult. But yeah, that's what I'm seeing a lot of is, again, this team has less power than you think. I mean, we've even done psychological safety workshops with that level, like that senior level. And they're like, how are we going to create this with our teams if we don't have it ourselves, right? If we're not feeling like we have it ourselves to be able to make these decisions, to be able to take these risks, how are we going to do that? So that's just something to keep in mind. Again, that's another reason why it fails, because we assume that these folks are the ones that are going to be the levers for change. And when they don't, we're calling them out, right? Instead of understanding that there really needs to be some real structural and systems change.
Yeah. And one of the things I wanted to, this has been on my mind quite a bit, because I think, LaTonya, you mentioned, your average leader doesn't have like an OD or change theory background, right? They have maybe business management, which, by the way, I think we need to restructure that curriculum to make sure that this work is incorporated. I think that could be something that we could do proactively as a community, making sure that those capabilities and those competencies are built in. But, I think about the boom of people who have entered this space of culture expert, DEI expert. And I really want to make it clear that, like, I see our work, and LaTonya, let me know if you see this as the same, but we have kind of an ethical responsibility to make sure that what we're doing is as sustainable as possible. So when I see, experts, maybe so-called experts who have kind of taken this opportunity to, create content and get out there and position themselves as DE&I experts, we need to be really careful about making sure that we're being clear about what we are actually going to produce for the organization and people's livelihoods, because this is an ethical question. Something that I've talked to my team. I have a few members of my team here, Ray, Kristen, Jessica. We talk a lot about what are the things that must happen in order for us to work with a client. For example, we will always ensure that the CEO is not just a sponsor, but an active participant in what we call a core team. We create a core team within the organization. If that HR or CHRO or that person who is the champion of the work does not allow us to do that, we will not work with that client, because we know that this is not going to go anywhere, right? Things like, we just started creating a we don't know what we're going to call it yet, but kind of a social contract that we create with the client to say, we need you all to do this work. We are guides, we are facilitators, but you all are the embodiment of the work. And so these are just things that I think we really need to start being very real with ourselves from a practitioner perspective, is what do we need to do to ensure that our work is sustainable as possible. Now, at the end of the day, if someone makes a decision that we're going to stop doing this work, we can't change that. But I think there are some ethical questions that we need to start digging deeper into.
Yeah, Angela, that's wonderful. I love that. And I think another thing that I'd add is that there's got to be, again, we throw the term psychological safety around, and I wrote, I talk about this a lot in my book. I mean, I wrote a couple chapters about this concept because it's so misunderstood and it's really hard to achieve. And one of the things I see, like when you're talking about this team, right, the CEO has to be a part of it. What also has to happen is these team dynamics need to be defined and followed. Again, going back to structures and systems, because if this team is going to get into a conflict, it just is. It's a matter of time, especially around a topic like this. Like, we all like to use different language. We all have different knowledge. Some of us are deeper than others. So there's going to be a conflict. And if you don't have some sort of team process around how you're going to navigate and recover from a conflict, it's all going to go out the window. Because what happens is the people that are going to speak up, that are probably a little bit more junior and are not the senior folks on the team, they're going to be speaking up and fearing for their jobs. They're going to be speaking up and fearing that they're going to fall off a glass cliff, right? And if you don't show them that, in other ways, it's not saying it. It's not saying you're safe here. That doesn't work. It's if you have this conflict and you come back, and let's say you end the meeting there because the conflict is getting really, really tough. You come back. I'm glad we had these discussions. Let's continue setting what our group values will be, our group agreements will be, our team agreements, and how are we going to navigate conflict? How did everybody feel about how that went? But you have to continue doing this. And I see, again, this drops off. And Angela, as you talked about these teams, the CEO needs this. When the CEO is a part of that team, that's when this is really important, because people will not speak up a lot of the times if they're there. But if the CEO comes back and every time it's, oh yeah, that was great. Thank you. Yeah, that was hard, but that was great. This is the kind of discussion I want. But the positive reinforcement is so important.
And I want to bring our attention back to a question that was in the chat just a bit ago. And I'm going to read it off here. Thanks, Jessica G, for this question. Have you ever seen an example of a gatekeeper protecting a leader from their own change process, the process of discovery and increased self-awareness?
LaTonya, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm just going back to the question and reading it. Why don't you go? Because this is an interesting, this is very specific. Yes.
Yeah. So we do, I do have an example. And, this kind of goes back to the gatekeeper archetype. And I will just mention these profiles, these archetypes that we're talking about. Nobody is doing this intentionally, right? I think there is a big part of how the organization has structured, how it's behaved in the past, the current culture that's in place that drives this type of behavior. So we are by no means pointing out individuals and saying, they're wrong. They're working within the system that's been created. So we have an example of a client that we worked with where, we had a CHRO, chief of staff type of role that really tried to be the buffer for the emotional part of the work, right? So it was a lot of gatekeeping of like, hey, that's too hard. Let me process that with them. And then you got the game of telephone, right? Where, somebody is, you have a person in between the information, and that becomes really messy and difficult. We struggled, one of the things that we try to do at the very beginning is build trust with that founder, with that CEO, with that team lead. And that's really important because this work is grounded in trust. People are in vulnerable moments all the time. And so if you haven't built that trust, you're going to get the shutdown. So the fact that we had this buffer really damaged our ability to ensure that that CEO was processing that change in an intentional way. Again, thinking about it as a grieving process. And that person who was buffering didn't know about change theory, wasn't an expert in the psychology of change, wasn't an expert in the grieving process. We have that expertise. So it was kind of like the blind leading the blind when it came to this work. And so we didn't have the best outcome, to be honest. And we're not pointing fingers, but the gatekeeping really does impact the way that we can make an impact within the organization.
I did want to come to a comment that Eliza said, and I'd love to hear what both you and Ray think, but not seeing leaders do their own work in working with nonprofits. I often see a bias that educating public-facing staff is the priority other than leadership. And I want to comment on this really quick, and then Angela, I see you smiling, so I think you do too. And Eliza, if you want to have a dialogue too. But what I found too, though, is, and this is just the work that we've done with nonprofits, a lot of times they don't really know what they want. And I think it's really hard, because I think what they're doing is they're trying to make it work for the grants, but it's not really for the org. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that, but I see, I do see people not doing their own work, but I also see nonprofits, again, trying to chase the buzzword and like make a case for what the grant is going to pay for. And they're really missing the point on what's going on in the org. So Eliza, I don't know if that's also what you're seeing, but I agree. I think that some leaders are, like there's just some people that are really, career development or fanatics, and they have a bunch of books, they're always reading, they're just naturally curious. But then there's also some people that just don't want to do that work. And as Ray talked about, even, the wellness and the vulnerability piece, like they just don't want to go there. And I also see, again, a systems thing, as the system's broken a lot in nonprofits and what they're rewarding and what people are getting money for and what they're not. And a lot of times what they're getting money for is not the problem. And and again, as Angela said, when if CEOs aren't on board, like we don't take those contracts, because we could see right through those when it's like, hey, can you do this RFP? And I'm like, well, this RFP is not really, it doesn't look like what you really need. And once we get and ask some questions, it's like, well, that's what the grant's for, so we're going to make our org fit that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, Crystal, I love what you said here around following trends, not facts. Absolutely. I think we have the tendency to create these bumper sticker like buzzwords because, we are, our attention spans are short these days, right? We want to get people's attention around this work. We want to package it in a way that people can understand in order to further the work. But I think we tend to lose the storyline. I mean, I feel the same, LaTonya, when I'm talking to some clients and they're like, we need DE&I training. I'm like, okay, so what does DE&I mean to you? And they can't answer it.
No.
They're reacting. And this is why we're seeing this cycle of backlash around what we're calling DE&I work, which is really around creating workplaces and systems that are made for everybody, where everybody can thrive and succeed. That is what we're doing. But because we've slapped DE&I or anti-racism or all the buzzwords into the mix, people are now having a reaction to the brand that we've created around it. I mean, I'll give you an example. I was in a coffee shop the other day and DE&I is in my vernacular daily these days because of the work we do. And I said it out loud and I got a death stare from someone who was in the coffee shop because they're hearing it in the media. It's been branded in different ways. And it's a shame that we've lost the storyline. I almost wanted to walk up to that person and say, hey, like, what's up? What do you think DE&I is? And hear their response versus what they're hearing in the media or hearing from a branded perspective. So totally agree with you. Yes. Come to the country of Florida. hijack narratives. Yeah, we have this challenge that I will say this is not new. The DE&I backlash is not anything new. And LaTonya, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I'm not surprised, and it's not new. And I think we can kind of predict what's going to happen next because it's kind of cyclical, is at least my observation.
Yeah, I think you started talking about this, and it probably is going to be something that, I don't know, maybe what I'm going to say is going to be a little controversial, but I think before 2020, like there was, like with the DEI was it was a smaller function, right? And it was usually, I think, as Angela, you put it, like people that worked in it usually had OD backgrounds. They had backgrounds where they've had to, coach. They've had backgrounds where they had to lead across politics. They might have had a talent management experience. But I think since the industry's gotten bigger, and it's not, I think it's one of the things I like to say is it's in its adolescence. So I think it's still figuring itself out. I think even the name of it is in its adolescence. It's not going to be called this even 5 years from now. There'll be another letter or there'll be a complete change. But what I think what's happening is, since there's such a big demand of, DEI practitioners in the last couple of years, and again, it just blew up and then it shrunk again. What do they call it? The DEIB recession. I think that when orgs were hiring people, they didn't really know the skill sets that are really needed. I mean, there's actually a lot of articles on this of why DEIB folks fail and what's really needed for this, but you need a background in some of this stuff. It's not enough just to have a passion, which is great. I mean, the passion is great. And yeah, if you have a passion, lead something in your ERG, but you can't be the head of DEI. And I think, again, I think it's in adolescence and we're still learning, but I really think that's a lot of what we saw, right, Angela? And it looks like you also agree. It's I think it's still kind of seeing what's happening. Even what Ray is saying, I also see an intersection of wellness, also collective wellness coming out of this. Like there's just so many things, again, that again, this is in its adolescence, and it's just not clear anymore of where it's going.
Yeah, and I would say, I think the discipline is in its adolescence. We know that the issues are longstanding, and oftentimes the cycle that I have seen, and I would love your thoughts, that usually it gets prompted by some kind of modern awakening, a collective awakening around an injustice. And so I think the perfect example of this is when George Floyd was murdered. You saw the organizations slapping together the communications and the anti-racism statements and investigating their value systems, and then hiring the chief diversity officers and committing to this change, but not really knowing how to do the work. And that is the cycle that I'm talking about, where it's not new. Some of the issues are new, how we're approaching the backlash might be new. But it kind of comes in cycles, I feel like. And how do we stop the cycle and really get the people together who have the skill, the knowledge, the passion, and the movement to make the changes, I think is the biggest question for me right now. How do we be integrators across disciplines to actually create change? And that's like a rhetorical question, but that's like, I'm just kind of like riffing out loud a little bit because I think about this a lot. And I worry for us, of course.
Yeah, I love that, Angela, because it's like, again, like, what's actually neat, like, can we get some more success stories and understand what's actually needed to do this work, and it's hard work. It really is. It's like, you're alone. Like when I've done like this work in orgs, I'm alone. I'm by myself and I have no one to talk to, and I don't have a team. And like, what is, being able to have these communities and be able to talk about that, like how do you get through that? How do you take care of yourself? Like with the chats, like, you know, with all the stuff that comes on that's going on in the world, it feels like a personal attack sometimes. Like, how do you do that and still do, you know, work in the world, you know, and what does that look like, and balancing all that? And so those are big questions. And again, I don't think it's just the how tactically, it's also, it's more of an existential thing too. Like, how do we do this and keep ourselves and communities healthy at the same time?
And I think that's a beautiful opportunity for us to really start to close out this session, because I feel like, you know, I'm looking at some of the names here, and a lot of you are activists, you're in the DE&I space, you're working within organizations who are doing this work. And I just acknowledge that you all are probably in the same place I am, where it's like, sometimes it's just exhausting. So maybe, Ray, this might be a good opportunity for you to, and I'm totally putting you on the spot here, but maybe close us out with like a mindful moment, some intention setting from this session that we just had today, walking away with just some feelings of healing and next steps.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. So what a mindful moment is, we're just going to do a few deep breaths together to ground ourselves, and we'll just sit in stillness, and I'll guide our awareness to certain aspects of the present moment. All right. So what I want you all first to do is pay attention to your posture. All right. Sit upright yet relaxed. I'm going to count us down 3, 2, 1. We'll take 3 deep breaths together. As you inhale, do so through your nose. Exhale through your mouth as if you're blowing out a candle. All right. 3, 2, 1. Take the first deep breath. And another. And one more. Allow your breathing to return to its normal pattern. Now notice the contact that your body is making to the surface beneath you. Really feel where those connections are being made. Now notice any movement that you feel throughout your body as you inhale and exhale. It could be in your chest or in your abdomen. Just notice where you feel movement. Now on your next exhale, I want you to allow the muscles of your face and forehead to relax. Notice any sensations you feel there. And on this next exhale, I want you to allow the muscles of your neck and shoulders to relax. Notice any sensations you feel there. Now, in this state of peace and calmness, I want you to bring to mind an intention that is salient for you in this moment after today's conversation. What is one thing that you're going to take with you that you'll implement into the work that you do? As you have that intention in mind, one thing I want to remind you is that you don't have to be perfect to be great. So be patient with yourself and be kind to yourself as you implement this intention beyond this event. All right, if your eyes are closed, slowly begin to blink them open. Welcome back. All right. So thank you all so much for joining us today. It was a phenomenal conversation. Hope you were able to take something of value from what we talked about today. I want to give both Angela and LaTonya the space to share with you all how you can stay connected with the work that each of them are doing. So I'll hand it over to you, Angela. Let everyone know how they can tap in with Call for Culture.
Yeah, thank you, Ray, for that just moment before you all head to your next meeting. I hope you all have walked away with something today. You can find me on LinkedIn under Angela R. Howard. You could also check out Call for Culture at callforculture.com. Tanya, what about you?
Yeah, everyone, thank you for joining. I'm still coming back from my meditation, which was really nice. It's been a couple of very busy weeks. So, yeah, and connect with me on LinkedIn, LaTonya Wilkins, or Change Coaches on LinkedIn, or changecoaches.io. And thank you everyone for attending. I love how we close this and just giving each other grace and kind of, I love the community piece of working through all of this together. So thank you.
All right. Now I will also share where you can stay in touch with me. So Raymond Ashiel, or you can put in Recovery Ray on LinkedIn. I'll pop up there. And you can also find me on Instagram at recovery.ray. And then my organization, Balance Period, you'll find it in the link on my bio in Instagram, but it's just at Balance Period on any social media platform that you are on. So thank you all once again for joining us today. As long as you registered on LinkedIn, you will get a link to the replay. So feel free to share that with anyone that you feel like this would also add value to. So thank you all once again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.